The legend of Manasa, the serpent goddess, and Chand Saudagar, an epic tale of pride, faith, and redemption. There was a region in the heart of ancient Bengal, bathed by sacred rivers and surrounded by jungle-covered hills and cultivated fields. In these fertile lands, life thrived abundantly under the blessing of the monsoon rains, which nourished the rice fields and filled the rivers to their brim. The waters, teeming with life, were the soul of the kingdom, the invisible thread that connected the villagers to the land and the land to the gods. The tropical climate brought fertility but also a hidden danger: the snakes that lived in the shadows of the fields, on the riverbanks, and in the depths of the forests. The villagers lived in constant reverence for the forces of nature, both fearing and venerating the snakes, creatures that embodied the duality of creation and destruction. To them, the snakes were not merely dangerous animals. They were living manifestations of the divine powers that controlled the cycle of life and death. These beings were under the control of Manasa, the serpent goddess, whose power over the lives of men was as great as that of the gods of the heavens. In the midst of this land of natural riches, a man thrived whose name resonated like that of a titan in commerce and fortune: Chand Saudagar. His caravans, loaded with exotic riches, traveled beyond the known borders of the kingdom, bringing back silks from distant lands, spices from the islands, and jewels from distant mountains. His wealth had no equal, and his businesses not only fed his family, but also hundreds of workers, artisans, and merchants who depended on his success. The house of Chand Saudagar was a mansion that rose upon a hill, from which one could view the wide river that crossed the region. It was a home built not only with stone and wood, but with the pride and ambition of generations of merchants who had accumulated fortune and prestige over time. The mansion's gardens were filled with fruit trees and flowers of all kinds, brought from various parts of the world. The air, always fresh thanks to the proximity of the river, was filled with the sweet aromas of jasmine and incense that the servants burned on small altars. But the true strength of Chand Saudagar did not lie solely in his material wealth. What truly distinguished him was his deep devotion to the god Shiva, the lord of destruction and transformation. In the private shrine of his house, in a room whose walls were covered with paintings depicting the epics of the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, stood a large statue of Shiva. This statue was the center of his spiritual life, and every morning before dawn, Chand Saudagar would bow before his god, offering prayers and sacrifices. In his meditations, he recited the ancient mantras with a devotion bordering on the fanatical. To Chand Saudagar, Shiva was not just a god who granted favors. He was the very reason for his existence. Shiva represented the power to destroy and rebuild, the eternal cycle of life and death that sustained the balance of the universe. Chand believed that his success in life was not just due to his skill as a merchant, but to the grace that Shiva had bestowed upon him. It was to Shiva that he turned for protection, and it was to Shiva that he rendered all his respect and loyalty. However, this intense religious fervor also fueled in Chand Saudagar an almost arrogant pride. He considered that only Shiva was worthy of worship and looked down on the deities his fellow villagers venerated, those he regarded as lesser gods. Among these deities was Manasa, the serpent goddess. To Chand Saudagar, worshipping a goddess like Manasa was a superstitious practice, a primitive tradition that had no place in his life. The villagers, however, had a completely different view. To them, Manasa was not a lesser goddess. Manasa was the protector of the most feared creatures on earth, the snakes. In rural areas, where venomous snakes could mean death in a matter of minutes, worshipping Manasa was essential for survival. During the festival of Nag Panchami, the villagers made great offerings in her honor, bringing milk and flowers to the temples and casting the offerings into the rivers where it was believed the divine snakes lived. Manasa, from her underground throne, reigned over the invisible kingdom of snakes, controlling their movements and destinies. To those who worshipped her, Manasa offered protection. The snakes did not attack her devotees, and families prospered under her grace. But to those who defied or ignored her, Manasa brought misfortune. The snakes, messengers of her wrath, were bearers of silent death. Chand Saudagar was well aware of the respect the villagers showed towards Manasa, but he did not share their devotion. "The snakes have no power over me," he would say arrogantly, when the local priest suggested he should at least make a small offering to Manasa. "Only Shiva deserves my worship. He is the destroyer of worlds, the supreme god. Why should I bow to a lesser deity who rules over snakes? I do not need her protection." The priests and villagers tried to warn him of the danger of his contempt, reminding him that even the most powerful men must respect the forces of nature and the gods who control them. But the words of the wise had no effect on Chand Saudagar, whose arrogance made him feel invulnerable. To him, devotion was a matter of hierarchy, and in that hierarchy, only Shiva held a place of true importance. However, Manasa was not a goddess who accepted contempt with indifference. From her underground realm, where the snakes lived in eternal symbiosis with the roots of trees and underground waters, Manasa watched Chand Saudagar's arrogance with growing anger. Although many saw her as a protective deity, her wrath could be as poisonous as the creatures she ruled. For generations, Manasa had been respected as the goddess who maintained the balance between life and death in nature. The snakes, though feared, were also essential to the ecosystem, controlling pests and keeping the cycle of life in harmony. But when that balance was challenged, Manasa did not hesitate to use her power to restore it, punishing those who failed to show proper respect. One night, while Chand Saudagar rested in his bed, surrounded by the luxury and comfort of his grand mansion, Manasa decided to act. She knew she needed to teach a lesson to this man whose pride had blinded him. So, from the depths of the earth, Manasa sent one of her deadliest snakes, a black cobra whose scales gleamed like onyx under the moonlight. Chand Saudagar's house, perched atop a hill and surrounded by lush gardens, seemed like an impenetrable fortress. But no wall, no matter how high, could stop the snake sent by Manasa. Under the cover of night, the cobra silently slithered through the open doors and windows, moving like a living shadow. Inside the house, Chand Saudagar's eldest son slept peacefully in his room. He was a young man who promised to follow in his father's footsteps, learning the arts of trade and diplomacy. However, that night, the promise of his future would be cut short forever. The cobra, with a swift and precise movement, coiled around the young man's feet and bit him on the ankle. The venom, potent and deadly, quickly spread through his body. The young man died silently, without even having time to wake. His breathing stopped, and his heart ceased beating within minutes. When dawn broke the silence of the night, the servants found the lifeless body of Chand Saudagar's eldest son. Cries of despair filled the house, and Chand Saudagar's wife, upon seeing her son's corpse, fell to her knees, unable to bear the pain. The grief of a mother losing her firstborn is indescribable, and her sobs echoed throughout the mansion. Chand Saudagar, though deeply grieved by the loss of his son, did not show signs of weakness before others. He gathered his family and servants and declared in a firm voice, "This is a test from Shiva. My God is testing me, and I must maintain my faith. I will not succumb to fear, nor will I yield to the superstition surrounding snakes. Shiva is the only god I must worship." But as Chand Saudagar clung to his pride, the villagers whispered among themselves. "It's Manasa," they said fearfully. "The serpent goddess has sent her punishment. If Chand Saudagar doesn't worship her, more tragedies will befall his house or team." Manasa, seeing that the death of the eldest son had not broken Chand Saudagar's pride, decided to intensify her punishment. She knew the merchant would not easily surrender, and that his most vulnerable point was his family. So, night after night, she sent more snakes to attack Chand Saudagar's remaining children. Despair took hold of the merchant's household. One by one, Chand Saudagar's children were bitten by the cobras sent by Manasa. Each morning, another lifeless body was found, until all of the merchant's children had been killed by the snake's venom. Sorrow and grief enveloped the mansion like a dark shroud, and the remaining servants lived in constant fear of being attacked by the snakes as well. Chand Saudagar's wife plunged into the deepest sorrow, begged her husband to reconsider his stance. "Please," she implored through tears, "we must make an offering to Manasa. This is her wrath unleashed upon us. If we don't appease her, we will lose everything we have left." But Chand Saudagar, blinded by his pride and devotion to Shiva, refused. "This is a test," he insisted. "I must maintain my faith. I will not bow to a lesser deity, even if we lose everything. Only Shiva deserves my devotion." As his children fell one after another, even Chand Saudagar began to question his beliefs. The nights were long and lonely, and in the darkness the pain of loss slowly consumed him. But still, his pride was too great to yield. With the death of his children, Chand Saudagar had lost the most precious thing he had. But Manasa was not finished with her punishment. She knew that if she wanted to completely break the merchant's pride, she had to strike him where it hurt the most after his family, his fortune. Chand Saudagar's wealth was immense, built over generations of successful trade. His merchant ships, which sailed the rivers and seas, were his main source of income. But Manasa, with her control over the forces of nature, decided to destroy this source of power. First, she sent snakes to ruin Chand Saudagar's fields. The venomous cobras slithered among the roots of the crops, poisoning the fertile land. The plants, which had flourished under the tropical sun, began to wither and die. The harvests were lost, and the farmers, who depended on the land for survival, were left with nothing. Next, Manasa turned her attention to Chand Saudagar's merchant ships. The water snakes, summoned by the goddess, attacked the vessels as they navigated the rivers. The ships, laden with riches, sank into the deep waters, taking with them the merchant's hopes and dreams. In a short time, the fortune Chand Saudagar had accumulated over his lifetime vanished. His house, once a symbol of wealth and power, was now a shadow of its former glory. The servants, terrified of the snakes and desperate for their own well-being, began to abandon the house one by one. Only a handful of people remained, and the mansion, once filled with laughter and life, was now silent and empty. One night, when all seemed lost and darkness enveloped his home, Chand Saudagar sat silently in the room that had once been his sanctuary. The walls, which had once resonated with mantras in honor of Shiva, now seemed empty and cold. His wife, broken by grief, had retreated to her room, and the few remaining servants walked like silent shadows through the house. That night, Chand Saudagar had a dream that would change his life forever. In his dream, Shiva, the god to whom he had dedicated all his devotion, appeared before him. But Shiva did not appear in his destructive and fearsome form, with his trident in hand. Instead, Shiva presented himself with deep serenity, like a sage who understood the deepest secrets of the universe. "Chand Saudagar," said Shiva in a voice that resonated through his being, "you have been a faithful devotee all your life, and because of that, you have known prosperity. But in your faithfulness, you have confused devotion with pride. You have shown great loyalty to me, but in your path you have ignored the balance that governs the universe. The forces of nature are sacred, and Manasa, though different from me, is an essential part of that balance." Shiva continued, "Manasa's power is not lesser than mine in her own realm. She rules over the snakes, and her wrath is a reflection of the imbalance you have caused by not respecting the forces of nature. I do not ask you to abandon your devotion to me, but you must learn to respect Manasa and recognize her place in the world." When Chand Saudagar awoke from his dream, he felt a mixture of confusion and relief. For years, his pride had been an impenetrable wall. But now, after all he had lost, he understood that he had to do something to restore the balance he had broken. Determined to end the suffering that had befallen his house, Chand Saudagar decided that he must perform a ritual in honor of Manasa. He knew he could no longer ignore the serpent goddess. However, though he was willing to acknowledge her power, his pride still prevented him from fully surrendering. He performed the ritual with his left hand, a symbolic gesture in Hindu tradition that meant he did it without true devotion. The left hand is considered impure for devotional acts, and this act was a way of preserving some of his dignity while appeasing the goddess. When Manasa saw that Chand Saudagar had finally acknowledged her power, albeit reluctantly, she decided to stop her vengeance. Satisfied with this small gesture of surrender, the serpent goddess showed compassion. In an act of divine mercy, Manasa brought Chand Saudagar's children back to life. Their bodies, which had been poisoned by the snakes, began to breathe again. The sorrow that had enveloped the house dissipated, and joy returned to the merchant's home. From the morning when Manasa, with a gesture of divine mercy, restored life to Chand Saudagar's children, a new energy enveloped the merchant's house. Where once there had been a heavy silence, filled with the sadness of loss and fear, now there were laughter and voices once again echoing through the halls. Chand's children, who had been dead, awoke with the breath of life renewed in their bodies, and their eyes once again sparkled with the youth they had once lost. Chand Saudagar's wife, who had wept for her children through endless nights, could not contain her tears of gratitude. Kneeling before Manasa's altar, she uttered prayers of thanks, expressing her deep appreciation to the goddess for returning to her family what she believed was lost forever. For months, her heart had been broken. But now, seeing her children return from the dead, she felt a peace she had never before experienced. The entire village was moved upon hearing the news. The story of Chand Saudagar's children being resurrected spread quickly everywhere. The villagers, who already feared and venerated Manasa, began to make even more offerings in her honor. They understood that the goddess had been just in her punishment, but she had also shown a compassion they had never before witnessed in such a powerful way. However, in Chand Saudagar's heart, the effects of these events were much deeper. Though his family had returned to life and his home was once again filled with joy, his spirit was marked by the lessons he had learned. He could no longer be the man he once was, full of pride and arrogance, confident that his devotion to Shiva protected him from all harm. He had seen how his family had fallen apart because of his stubbornness, and though he had regained his children, the emotional cost had been enormous. Chand Saudagar knew that although he could not recover what he had lost in terms of wealth and material power, he had gained something much more valuable, the wisdom and understanding that the world was much more complex than he had believed. He now saw clearly that although his devotion to Shiva remained important, he also had to learn to respect the other forces that governed the universe, such as Manasa and the creatures of nature under her protection. As the months passed, Chand Saudagar's house began to rebuild. Though the merchant's material fortune had been almost completely destroyed, Chand was no longer as interested in wealth as before. The lessons he had learned had taught him that, although prosperity was important, there was something far more essential: the balance between the forces of the natural and spiritual worlds. He devoted himself to meditating more deeply than before, reflecting on the relationship between gods and mortals. He now understood that, while Shiva was the god of destruction and regeneration, the cycle of life and death could not be explained only from the perspective of absolute power. The lesser gods, like Manasa, were also part of the divine order, controlling aspects of nature that were fundamental to the everyday lives of humans. The snakes, which he had once seen as mere poisonous creatures, now became for him symbols of the interconnectedness of life, death, and nature. One day, while walking along the river that flowed near his house, Chand Saudagar saw a snake resting on the bank. Before, he would have felt fear or disgust at the presence of such an animal, but now, in his heart, he felt respect. The snake, slithering slowly through the mud, reminded him of the very nature of life: mysterious, dangerous, but also essential to the balance of the world. As he watched it, Chand realized that there was something deeply spiritual in the way Manasa had worked through her creatures to teach him a lesson. The snakes were feared and revered, but now they were also a constant reminder of his own humility. The respect Chand Saudagar began to show for Manasa was not total devotion like he had for Shiva, but he had found a new balance in his life. Every year, during the festival of Nag Panchami, the merchant made discreet offerings to Manasa, acknowledging her power and place in the universe. He no longer felt the need to challenge her or consider her a lesser deity. Instead, he saw her as a goddess who represented the invisible power of nature, a power he had learned to respect. In the kingdom, the story of Chand Saudagar and Manasa became a lesson of wisdom that was passed down from mouth to mouth. The villagers and farmers told the tale of how the most powerful merchant had been destroyed by his pride, only to be saved by acknowledging the forces of nature. The story became a warning to those who thought they could ignore the invisible forces that controlled the world, and also a source of comfort to those who feared the gods' power. Over time, the kingdom began to prosper once again. The crops, which had been destroyed by the snakes, grew back stronger, and the farmers returned to their fields with a renewed sense of devotion and respect for Manasa. The river, which had witnessed the tragedies of Chand Saudagar, continued its course unchanging, as a symbol of eternity and the constant flow of time. The villagers celebrated the festival of Nag Panchami with more fervor than ever, knowing that snakes not only represented death but also life and rebirth. The fallen hero Chand Saudagar was no longer seen as the titan he had been before his fall. Instead, he was viewed as a wise man, someone who had learned the hardest lessons of life through loss and suffering. He became a respected counselor among merchants and farmers, and those who had once envied him now sought his advice. As his reputation as a man of wisdom grew, so did his new fortune, though this time not in material terms. Chand Saudagar found an inner peace he had never known before. He no longer sought wealth as an end in itself, but saw it as a tool to do good and to help those who needed his guidance. He used his resources to build temples, not only in honor of Shiva but also of Manasa, ensuring that future generations would not forget the lessons he had learned. The years passed, and Chand Saudagar aged in his mansion, surrounded by his family, who had been restored by Manasa's grace. His children grew into wise men and women, inspired by their father's experiences. None of them forgot the lesson their family had learned at such a high cost, that pride is a dangerous force, and that only through respect and humility can one live in peace with the forces that govern the universe. In the final years of his life, Chand Saudagar was often seen walking through the gardens of his home, contemplating the snakes that lived among the flowers and trees. Where he had once seen only danger, he now saw the beauty and wisdom of these creatures. He knew his life was coming to an end, but he also knew that he had achieved a deep understanding of the world and his place in it. When Chand Saudagar finally left this world, he did so in peace, surrounded by his family. His death was not seen as a tragedy, but as the culmination of a full life, a life in which he had learned the most important lessons that fate could offer. The villagers built a small shrine in his honor, not because they saw him as a god, but as a man who had shown the capacity to change, to learn, and to redeem himself. Chand Saudagar's legacy was not just the wealth he had accumulated or the caravans he had led. His true legacy was the story of how he had learned to respect the balance of the world's forces, of how he had overcome his pride and found wisdom in humility. The sages of the kingdom shared this story with future generations, reminding them that, while humans may try to dominate the world, they must always respect the forces that govern it. Many years after Chand Saudagar's death, the region of Bengal continued to flourish under the blessing of its gods. The river, which had witnessed so many tragedies and redemptions, continued to flow unchanged, carrying with it the stories of generations. The snakes, still living on the edges of fields and forests, were now seen not only as threats, but as symbols of a deeper balance between nature and the gods. The festival of Nag Panchami continued to be celebrated every year, and at each ceremony the villagers remembered the story of Chand Saudagar and his surrender to Manasa. The legend had endured through time, not only as a warning against pride, but also as a reminder of the power of compassion and redemption. The men and women of the kingdom knew that, although the gods could be fearsome, they could also show mercy to those who learned to respect their ways. And so, in the fertile lands of Bengal, the story of Chand Saudagar continued to be told from generation to generation, not as the story of a proud merchant, but as the story of a man who, through suffering, had learned the deepest lessons of the universe. That balance is the key to life, and that only through respect and humility can one live in harmony with the forces that govern the fate of all human beings. The Naga culture refers to the traditions, customs, and beliefs of the Naga people, a group of indigenous tribes primarily residing in northeastern India and parts of Myanmar. These tribes, while diverse, share deep cultural roots and a strong sense of collective identity. The Naga are known for their rich oral heritage, which includes creation stories, mythology, legends of heroes and iconic figures, as well as traditional music and dance. With a history marked by struggles for autonomy and the preservation of their culture against external influences, Naga culture offers a unique perspective on the diversity and resilience of indigenous cultures. Understanding their history is important because Naga tales not only reflect their values and worldview, but also remind us of the significance of preserving indigenous cultures in a globalized world. Their history provides lessons on connection to nature, community, and survival in the face of adversity. Thank you for joining us on this magical journey through the stories and legends of the Naga tribe. If you enjoyed this video and want to discover more ancient tales, don't forget to give it a like and share it with your friends. And if you haven't subscribed yet, make sure to do so and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming legends. Every week we'll bring you new stories filled with mystery, wisdom, and magic. See you in the next tale.